Good evening, everyone. After a little fiddling, I welcome you to our Feeling Thursday EU King of Fighters Lounge. We are currently waiting to spectate matches, as it was not initially possible, and I figured I wouldn't start the stream until I had everything fixed. There was a little bit of confusion before. Well, we are here and ready to fight. Again, this is an EU lounge. You can probably join if you are anywhere on the east coast of the US or on the rim of the Atlantic Ocean in some way with decently good internet. So the Caribbean, northern parts of South America, you probably will have at least a decent connection, but this is still a lounge targeted and made by someone in Central Europe, so it is definitely going to be a problem if your internet is less stable or whatever else. There will of course also be fluctuations, as you can see from watching the ping just flip around. Fortunately, this is King of Fighters, and the netcode will probably manage to get you through most situations, especially since we are still mostly beginners at this game. It got added to a very large pile of games we wanted to and like to play, and that pile is not getting smaller, meaning that each time every game gets less and less focus, but fortunately the team tends to train and build styles of play around neutral understanding of spacing and things that tend to carry over from game to game, at least right now. Since that fits most of our content, you can see that the 6 number ID to join this lounge is both in the stream title today and visible on screen for if you for some reason aren't able to see the stream title easily. My voice has gone back to being somewhat nasal for some reason. I may be reducing how much I taught today. The lounge might also be slightly shorter than the full 1 hour because I don't necessarily plan to go too far past the 1:30 Eastern Standard Time endpoint. This is intended to be happening at around 7:30 or so in Europe. I wonder if I have time to change all this. I do. I was going to do this before, but did not want to delay the stream any further. And this might be something not many people are familiar with, the fact that you can just, while waiting for matches, assuming you're not spectating for some reason, if you wanted to set teams, you should be able to do that. I don't actually know whether or not it would prevent you from getting pulled into the next one, though. I'll treat that as the least likely team to actually happen. And throw in the default one after it. Well, for those of you who are not familiar, let's hit some explanations. See? Deep. It is just a lounge. And now it looks like something's happening. Opponent left.
Select members. Put all your skills to the test and show us a battle worthy of legend.
At the screen you can use those preset teams that you just saw me doing by pressing square, I believe, if you are not the player. Sorry, if you are the player, and everyone else gets to use it for chat.
Select order. Select stage.
Oh, it's L3 you press for randomness here. Strange plateau. When was this added?
Get ready for a battle of titans.
Alright, it appears we are starting with Benimaru versus Yashiro, which is a matchup from Yashiro's side based almost entirely on getting into range to hit heavy kick and crouch heavy kick. And from Benimaru's side, oh no, I'm wrong. I forgot I can't actually see that. This matchup doesn't have like as many specifics to it, you just fight more or less. Yashiro's armor comes up a little less, and Joe isn't usually far enough away that the various dashing punches are as required. If anything, I would say that the Joe player is watching to see whether or not they can catch Yashiro trying to approach, whereas Yashiro is trying to approach not necessarily to hit, but to make Joe block. Once you've made Joe block, chances are that Yashiro is at advantage relatively, and can therefore prepare to do a chase. And Joe isn't as good at stopping chases because of the relatively longer startup on his space control moves. And you can do basically the same things for Ralph. Ralph's chases are less effective, so you have to play a lot more neutral. But you can see there, it's not really obvious, but Joe doesn't have a lot of really quick moves for stopping you from getting in if he's also just had to backdash out of a situation. Using your roll to try to catch him, though, will normally deal with him putting up his punches as a shield and you not being able to do much of anything. He's also one of the characters who's probably weakest to charge Galactica Phantom. Not that he can't get out of the way, but I mean, it's Galactica Phantom. Whip doesn't have to worry about much of this as much. Though Joe does have a move that will take him forward in an arc and off the ground, generally she can swing out the whip straight or attack his legs, and it's not really much he can do about it. From Joe's side, you're more so trying to back off a little bit, the way one does in other matchups of this style, like Dalsim and so on, and then either dodge from outside the range of where those buttons were going to hit you in the first place, or use the arc. And Yuri's style here is basically similar. She's trying to get just outside of Whip's range, and then use something else, possibly roll, and possibly just one of her longer dash-in moves. to get close enough to then start offense. Because once she's closer, her speed is a relatively large advantage. As long as she stays in motion like this, it's actually relatively hard for Whip to get much damage too. With most of it coming from things like that. But anyone who's played fighting games long enough knows that that's mostly a matter of you needing to time something differently from the attacker side in order to deal with your opponent's good defense. Meaning that is the spot on screen that favors Whip the most, where Yuri has no space to go back out of the range of the whip, but also can't just jump and get over it. Benimaru has a few more options because he has longer range strikes that he can reach with from full range and charged attacks that are projectiles. But overall, Whip still wants to stand in approximately the same spot and possibly roll when she sees Benimaru move. Not necessarily because he can't respond, but the player has to spend a lot more time checking exactly where Whip is on screen to know whether or not she's going to end up behind them. Now, given the slowness of her moves, this isn't necessarily a really powerful threat. But Benimaru's moves also take relatively long to recover. They're very good at keeping people out and stopping certain approaches because there's so much space and time that they cover. But the fact that they cover that much time makes it more difficult for him to recover in time to get away from someone who's gotten behind him. He's just usually really good at preventing anyone from getting behind him because he doesn't normally need to hit any buttons or move around. Only the longest range characters are capable of making that happen.
Set. Round one. Ready, go!
So yes, you see here a lot of Yashiro's capacity to stop the Hurricane Upper, and once he's done that, mostly you just defend a little bit so that Joe either has to start retreating so that you never have to worry about him hitting anything, or you just get to keep on counter pressuring every time because you can largely block Joe's stuff. The main thing, therefore, is can you read whether or not Joe has used or plans to use a style of move that will keep you out. And once you've realized or brought down the matchup to that level, Yashiro has a lot more options. Ralph, again, does not, but Ralph is coming into this with more meter and therefore at least some options for Galactica Phantom, and his heavy kick reaches really far. He also has like this straight in front of him style punch that does a good job of keeping a lot of things Joe wants to do from happening without a trade. And while I wouldn't recommend the Ralph kick, overall being able to get over that punch shield, for example, while taking very little damage even if it doesn't work, makes this one of those matchups where your main goal is to just power through the problem and not think too much about what your opponent is doing. You can't really say that Joe is a defensive character, but he's good at fighting from max range, and understanding how to get through that max range and catch his retreats will force the player to play a little differently at least. Most people will have an adaptation to it, but you do have to generally deal with first order strategies. Now here's a matchup where the Ralph kick takes a front seat quite a lot, because Yuri's not terribly good at punishing it, and it puts Ralph at a really advantageous spacing relative to her as a character. And you see the immediate correct option used. Just go straight into uppercuts when you feel the need to use anything. Because even though you can be punished, depending on the status of the matchup, you're not going to be punished that heavily, and you can just uppercut on reaction, especially if they're trying to do max range Ralph kick anyway. So we're back to Yuri trying to navigate through and around the outer edge of Whip's range. This is usually a relatively slow process, especially if you don't have a lot of meter to like finish her off explosively. But it does force the Whip player to end up in a lot more chase situations, rather than you as the Yuri trying to push through this character's strong defense. Really good spacing on the Ryoken also helps a lot, but note that that might not be enough. Whip can in fact bring you down from there, she just has to be in defensive mode when she does it. So if you get the player to stop thinking defensively, to move forward to try to reach with the Whip, you're more likely to have success with the air fireball. And now we're back to, how can I roll past you? She is also blessed by the fact that, unlike Benimaru to a point, when she is in close, her close normals are quite quick, and therefore, assuming she didn't start something before, which is usually not the case, she can in fact get control at close range in those ways. So we're already seeing rapid enough adaptations moving through the various match spaces. So I'm going to let them continue at it, possibly with character changes, but overall continue at it. And we'll see what we get in terms of moving the matchups up one level, or recognizing what needs to be practiced in order to achieve that. With new games, that is often the focus of our lounges. It's always good to test out things, especially under stream conditions where like analysis is basically ongoing the entire time. And you don't have to guess, because I've literally devoted an hour in this case to talking about things. To decide, is this something I need to practice? Or is it something that I can do and just don't like doing, so I get like distracted? We will see one change toward the end, and that is a change in matchup. Because Whip versus Robert is very different from Whip versus Benimaru. Robert is a lot more mobile. But the first parts are still going to be basically the same types of practice, so Joe's moves meant for keeping Yashiro out can be punished, actually. So a lot of this is understanding whether or not you can get past the Hurricane uppers, or block them, or do anything related to that. While Yashiro will suffer if Joe puts up his punching shield, basically, he can use his heavier leaping strike in order to get through that move because of the delay on it. That delay is going to save your life a lot with this character. So don't think of it as, this move is too slow. You need to think of it as, this move is here so that when I've seen you do something that will last a long time, I can react without having to think too hard about how to, like, time this. Let the game time your counterattack for you. Ralph's main problem is that, of course, Joe can stay very far away. But staying very far away is still not sufficient, especially once Ralph really gets going. Because he generally only needs one good interaction of the pummeling type, and in order for someone to manage to stay very far away, they must push themselves more and more toward the corner where Ralph has additional control. As he has some of the best corner guard in the game as a whole. Similarly, this matchup causes a large amount of meter use on the part of the Yuri player, with Ralph not really needing to use the meter for as much. This of course skews the final aspect of the matchups, because now we've got two people with little or no meter. I would say that Robert is advantaged in this matchup when Ralph has no meter, because Robert has so many different ways he can attack. And Ralph's moves take relatively long and are strictly targeted, let's say. So he has to make Robert miss and then actually land hits, but Robert fights using range and a lot of basically heavily structured things to put you where he wants you first. You can see some stuff paying off here from some good max range Ralph attacks, which are probably the only thing that gets you through Robert's movement at all. But even that, you're still more or less powering through, but your opponent can fake you out. They don't have to dive kick, they can just jump. They don't have to wake up with anything slower, they can just use... I'm gonna call it Tatsu. So you'll notice that Ralph is literally aiming for trades here, just taking more damage, but not really caring, because at the end of the day, the meter gain is about the same on both sides, and Ralph uses the meter better in the matchup as a whole. In order to keep the opponent on their toes, Robert must eventually almost always use it up somewhere to resolve the situation of the opponent getting too close, for example. Whereas Ralph doesn't really benefit from using the meter much at all. There's not much to do with it that would directly influence the matchup unless you have enough of it to dump into big damage. So, back to this matchup and Yashiro playing the waiting game. Again, it's absolutely not that you can't attack, but that in order for Joe to keep you out, Joe must be susceptible to your big leaping punch. Just the way that moves interact in this game make this possible. And if you think that the player is going to wait for the big leaping punch to counter it, then you've gotten back where we started. You are able to use the rushing punches and not worry about the issues with the Hurricane Upper, for example. means that Joe spends a lot of time, as just shown, figuring out the exact correct time to backdash. But depending on what Yashiro did, it still doesn't work. He can just follow on from there and still reach, forcing Joe to play even more waiting and even more defensively. In this case, tactically for these two players, it doesn't necessarily matter if Yashiro manages particularly well or not, because you could honestly just build up meter on Yashiro and assume Ralph will take care of Joe, with nearly no effort. Because Ralph gets a bigger punish here, strictly speaking, and has advantage after the interaction has happened. This is an even worse situation technically now, because if Ralph can win this matchup, it's less likely that Yuri will have much meter to do anything with herself, making it even more likely he will win the next as well. But 2 bars, because she's going to get one from being the second character to come in, is probably enough if used very carefully. One thing that helps Yuri in this matchup more so than anything else, aside from the Ralph kick problem, is that she can use her command grab because Ralph isn't trying to get out of range. Ralph players are not likely to backdash out of the situation and therefore will more likely get grabbed than not. But it was in fact enough meter.
Now or never. Ready? Go!
That is one of Whip's strongest options you see there, mainly because if used correctly, she will be able to fake out certain things that Yuri is trying to do. And because Yuri must play the matchup this way from relatively far away when you're not going full on offense with like a very specific pressure string that also doesn't work all that well, there's more time for Whip to do that sort of move and get away with it. Yuri can of course shield herself even from far away, but that's like bringing it all the way back to neutral. It isn't very specific about what needs to be done from either side relative to it. It takes a while to get used to that particular character's spacing control because her pushback is really variable compared to most characters. Nearly everyone else, they're hitting you from the front, punching, kicking, or whatever else, and their moves will push you back some amount. Whereas with Whip, not only do her moves sometimes not push you back, some of them, even blocked, pull you closer, meaning that you spend a lot more time trying to figure out whether or not you can counterattack her if she is on mid-range offense instead of long-range defense. We were considering whether or not it made more sense to have these matches in general be like just one, but I'm still working on this because it depends on who's in the match and like who's in the lounge. Now you see the change happening already, and that is where it pays off the most. Yashiro and Joe basically just don't interact when Yashiro does the leap in particular timings. But they do end up closer, which is the range Yashiro wants, and Joe doesn't. Even that is still just more or less the same situation. Taking the hit means that Joe must then land and then backdash to stay out of the close range, and Yashiro will usually recover fast enough to do the chase, depending on where in the height of the thing he got hit. So now we're seeing more offensive-ish Joe play, which isn't really too difficult for Ralph to deal with. It's just a matter of going back to the raw, I'm punching you now, and advancing punches. Because Ralph is basically a freight train that Joe can't really prevent from coming at him without acting very proactively, more or less. Since the easier way to deal with that is to just defend harder, one can often switch up those styles when you want to. But you are dealing with a player who will more or less attack the entire time. Even while playing Whip, because of the way that Joe moves, it makes more sense to at least try to be aggressive. But that means learning to go through all of the things he does and deal enough damage for it to be fun. Generally, when facing really defensive opponents, there's only one or two tricks that you're allowed to use. That's part of the benefit, part of the purpose of retreating from the opponent and getting a lot of space between you and them, particularly if your character has longer moves for that purpose. But now you're looking at, knowing this possibly for the entire rest of stream, what is this stage? Two players who definitely want to attack each other all of the time.
Get ready for a battle of titans!
Unfortunately, they also are playing characters where that's never the best idea. So understanding whose rhythm should be on offense or defense in order to win is one thing. But we are probably going to slip into our usual habits of experimenting with how many different ways there are to break through the opponent's attack with your own. Yep, have not seen this stage before. It's good.
Ready? Go!
Because both characters are so relatively good at pushing through, one of the better things you could do once launching your own attack or ending up in a close range is to not do anything, because, or rather delay your action very little. Simply because the opponent's next thought is usually, how do I break through your attack, like this. But if you didn't make an attack, the situation's better for you, obviously. And similarly, you see from the other side, there were at least 3 critical blocks there because I'm at a disadvantage, but I'm still going to try to break through anyway. And here we have playing to my strengths on that regard, therefore. Because this character no longer has that problem. Not only is her attack a throw in the first place, staying still for a little while doesn't tend to lead to anything in particular negative. Ralph can deal with this a little too simply relative to other characters in that he just goes for a heavy punch at close range, and it sort of options to let Shermie's what she's trying to do most of the time. The good range on his heavy kick tends to deal with the rest. One thing he generally doesn't want to do, and you see it being avoided very, very skillfully here, don't go in the air. Especially not when Shermie is sitting on this much meter. You can go in the air against Iori, because the meter is not going to do as much damage to you. You'll still get knocked out quite a lot of the time, but definitely not the way that Iori's damage bursts out of that. And of course, if you make the opponent think you're going to do something and then don't, Iori will miss altogether. So it's a good way to prevent your opponent from approaching you by just basically neutral jumping. And you have time to react in the air if Iori attempts to come at you. Even if I use the overhead claw. Against Whip, I need that move a lot more. This is all a timing thing. Iori is watching to figure out how long do I have to do my move. Are you on defense or not? Because if you mess it up, this sort of thing happens. And Iori's EX moves will not necessarily get him into better positions. But she can take so long to do things that it's possible for him to grab her. That move is less useful most of the time, but, you know, still something in there. And that is just advantage, so there's not much you can do about it. Whip is a lot less suited for that whole breaking through your opponent's continued offense, since even her invincible-ish moves don't work quite that way, and she's usually better off like trying to wake up with a roll or something to at least force the opponent to throw her. Depending on the opponent's throw, that's either a strong tactic or basically useless. But for this matchup, for most situations in which Iori and Whip are facing off, you can roll a lot more and try to avoid situations that way, because Iori's throw doesn't really like put her at disadvantage in the same way. This matchup is almost always don't whiff, don't flinch. Both of these characters have just enough speed on their normals that if you flinch, you tend to get hit. Flinching being specifically going out of defense for a moment and then not being sure if to go back or not. I think I keep on messing that up. It's amazing how quickly my mind like adapted back to the slight hold of the button that KOF moves require. I don't think I do it in other games, but then again, other games don't have... Other games require you to hit more buttons after because their moves tend to have more options after them. One of the rare moments where going into the air is a good idea. Ralph is also a character who's actually fairly good at stopping Shermie from just doing this. So a lot more of my time is spent getting in really close to do this one, to prevent my opponent from just hitting buttons in neutral. That option is taken for a different purpose. I'm just doing it to make sure that they keep on thinking about the fact that I can, so that I can run up and do something else. I find this match is probably really stressful from the Ralph side because you're just spending almost all of your time trying to react really quickly to things that Shermie's trying to grab you, and you just have to like stop her from doing it all of the time. Iori has a similar problem in that Ralph defends the space in front of him so relatively well that your only actual strong option is to fake him out or throw projectiles, which works when Ralph players are trying to get in on you, but when they think you're just going to keep on throwing them, they just tend to sit through it and not care. He's also a fairly strong character at just rolling through and then doing something quick to ignore you. But note that if you just try to roll through Iori fireballs on Ralph as your base thing, it probably won't work. I can say though that at this point of the match, the only thing I'm worried about is that I managed to get this far without actually getting to use any of the meter. Because she's also susceptible to this as a result. Once you've got enough meter, Iori has just enough speed to do a lot of things. That one, however, was chip damage, so... Okay, let's see. So these take about, let's say, 5 minutes each. I'm not really sure how to optimize this for later streams. But this is almost certainly bringing us to the end of this one. So yes, 4 full matches per stream as opposed to 12, but the 12 are... Okay.
Round 1. Ready? Go!
One of Yashiro's main problems in this matchup is that there is literally no way to know how to defend against Mary. Since they changed the way she has access to certain moves, but she still has them all. Not even just going, okay, well, I'll block. You have to not only block, but be ready for specific things so that the block is enough, and so on. So your life is quite hard. One of your better options is usually to just hit heavy kick, but even this will be beaten by certain things. So, yeah, just play to whatever style you have. This is why you can't flinch, because if you feel as if you must be on defense and you don't know what to do, you're even more likely to get caught by it. Shermie's not so much the same. Shermie's a lot more about catching Yachiro on landing when he uses some sort of approach or tries to hit a button, because this is a character that can basically whiff punish you from half a screen away with a grab. You can get out of this, but depending on how long the animation for your character's attack is and whether or not it hits in front of you. Ralph, for example, doesn't have the same sort of problem because Ralph can hit the heavy kick, and there are situations in which when he does, even if Shermie was going for this, he will actually hit her because, again, the game doesn't care about those sorts of things. I really thought that one would have worked. That one is one you don't see Shermie get to use that much, mostly because it feels like the purpose of the move was changed. I'm still working out exactly what they're trying to do with it. It does combo though, and it is for avoiding certain grounded style attacks, though I'm not fully familiar on which ones it avoids and which ones it doesn't anymore. Unlike Dolores, that's what I was talking about before. If I try to use the dash and grab, if there's a hitbox active anywhere between Shermie and the person, it generally doesn't work, particularly if that hitbox is not connected to a throwable position. But I now have enough meter with Iori once again to at least try to do something. And mainly the thing that hurts her here is Iori moves forward very fast when you need him to. He also extends his hurt boxes forward quicker than a lot of other characters. But it doesn't really matter if he's hitting you. Unfortunately, Whip's main response to this is to roll, which doesn't give you basically any damage that I'm aware of, but I'm pretty sure that that could be a thing, and I'll see whether or not I see any matchups where that's the response taken by the Whip player to actually roll and then find a way to do damage. But that brings us to the end of this stream. Like I said, I'm not necessarily extending it. And you can join us again later on if you are just an NA style person watching right now. For some reason. The lounge will stay open for at least a little longer, I believe. But overall, this has been a good stream. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.